The year was 1864, and America was running out of blood. After 3 years of slaughter, hope was a currency no one could afford. The Union had won victories at Gettysburg and Vicksburg, but the war was far from over. Every triumph seemed swallowed by new graves. Every sunrise brought news of another battle lost or barely won. Yet out of the mud, smoke, and despair, one man rose with a quiet fire in his eyes. His name was Ulysses S. Grant. Before we begin, remember, you're watching this without subscribing. If you believe history should be told with truth and heart, please subscribe to our channel. Your support helps us continue bringing the story of the American Civil War to life, one chapter at a time. Grant was not a man of glory. He was small, quiet, and unassuming, a soldier who smoked cigars and rode with a slouched hat, saying little and drinking less than his legend claimed. But beneath that calm exterior burned a relentless will. To his men, he was old 3 stars, the general who never quit. When Lincoln appointed him general-in-chief of all Union armies, the nation finally had a leader who understood one brutal truth. The war would end only when the Confederacy could no longer fight. He wasted no time. While other generals hesitated or sought the perfect plan, Grant believed in one thing: constant pressure. He reorganized the Union's scattered forces into a single machine. William Tecumseh Sherman would take the Western armies and push through Georgia. George Meade would lead the Army of the Potomac, and Grant himself, calm, determined, would ride with Meade and face Robert E. Lee head-on in Virginia. 2 men now held the fate of the nation, opposites in every sense. Lee noble, disciplined, revered in the South as almost divine. Grant, rough, methodical, unshakable. Theirs would be a duel not of strategy alone, but of endurance. 2 generals, 2 visions, and one blood-soaked road between them. In early May 1864, Grant crossed the Rapidan River with 120,000 men, a sea of blue uniforms vanishing into the tangled forest known as the wilderness. The air was thick with spring pollen and smoke. It was a place where visibility was measured in yards, not miles. A labyrinth of brush, vines, and dry leaves ready to burn. Lee struck first. On May 5th, his veterans surged out of the shadows, crashing into Grant's lines. The woods erupted with musket fire and cannon blasts that shattered trees like lightning. Men could barely see their enemies. They fought by sound, by instinct, by flashes of flame. The forest caught fire, trapping the wounded between advancing lines. Screams echoed through the smoke as men burned alive. Grant stood firm. His face was grim, his cigar clenched tight. Other generals before him would have ordered retreat. But when word came that the lines were buckling, Grant's reply was simple: "We'll fight it out right here." That night, the woods glowed with embers. The cries of dying men drifted through the dark. But for the first time, the Union Army did not turn back toward Washington. Instead, at dawn, Grant ordered his columns to march south. When the weary soldiers realized they were advancing, not retreating, cheers erupted through the smoke. "Grant fights!" they shouted. It was the moment the Union found its iron heart again. The war had found its engine, and it would not stop until it reached Richmond. Lee knew what was coming. He had faced brilliant tacticians before, McClellan, Burnside, Hooker, and beaten them all. But Grant was different. He didn't care about elegant maneuvers or flawless plans. He cared only about wearing Lee down, inch by inch, man by man, until the Confederacy bled dry. The armies clashed again at Spotsylvania Courthouse. For 2 weeks they fought across trenches and fields, through mud and rain, like 2 beasts locked in a death struggle. On May 12th, Union soldiers charged a bulging line in the Confederate defenses, a place forever remembered as the Bloody Angle. For 20 hours they fought hand to hand. Bayonets, musket butts, and bare hands became weapons. The dead formed walls waist high. The wounded drowned in trenches filled with rain and blood. Soldiers on both sides wrote later that it was not a battle. It was madness. Through it all, Grant refused to relent. When an aide warned that Lee might try to retreat, he said simply, "If he does, I will follow him to the gates of hell." He had learned what Lee could not afford to admit, that the Confederacy was running out of time. By June, Grant had already lost over 50,000 men, more than the entire Confederate army at Richmond. Newspapers in the North screamed for his dismissal. Grant the Butcher, they called him. But Lincoln did not waver. He told his cabinet, "I can't spare this man, he fights." The truth was brutal. Grant was doing what no one before him had dared, grinding Lee's army down by sheer persistence. Every mile south brought them closer to the Confederate capital. Every battle left Lee weaker, his ranks thinner, his supplies gone. By mid-June, Grant's forces reached the outskirts of Petersburg, where miles of trenches marked the beginning of a new kind of warfare, one that looked more like the grim conflicts of the 20th century than the 19th. The age of glory was over. Now it was a war of exhaustion, of mud, blood, and smoke. The old rules of war had burned away in the wilderness, and America itself was being remade in the fire. As summer deepened, Grant's campaign stalled before Petersburg's defenses. The two armies dug in. 10 months of siege would follow. But Grant did not lose heart. He knew that in the west Sherman was marching through Georgia, carving his own path of destruction toward the sea. For Grant, the strategy was simple: strike everywhere, all the time. Give the enemy no rest, no chance to regroup, no hope of survival. It was not elegant, it was relentless. And in that relentlessness, Grant found something that even Lee could not match: the will to keep fighting no matter the cost. By the end of 1864, both armies were shadows of what they had been. Yet the Union, battered, bloodied, unbroken, still moved forward. Grant had turned war into endurance, and endurance into destiny. The fields of Virginia were littered with the wreckage of 3 years of conflict. But in the distance, faint and flickering, the light of victory could finally be seen. The North had found its hammer, and the South was beginning to crack. But in the heart of Georgia, another storm was gathering, one that would burn a path through the Confederacy itself. By the summer of 1864, the war had become a storm without end. The land between the Rapidan and the James River was no longer countryside. It was a graveyard. Forests burned, rivers ran red, and whole towns vanished beneath the march of armies. The soldiers no longer spoke of glory. They spoke only of survival. Ulysses S. Grant had promised to crush the Confederacy by relentless attack, and he meant it. Each day, his armies pushed south, inch by inch, losing thousands to gain a mile. It was no longer strategy. It was endurance. War stripped of illusion. But the men did not yet understand what awaited them at Cold Harbor, a place where courage itself would meet its breaking point. After the fires of the wilderness, Grant's army staggered into new battles with no pause for breath. At Spotsylvania courthouse, he hurled his men again and again against Lee's fortified lines. The fighting stretched over 2 weeks, 2 weeks of rain, mud, and blood. The earth itself seemed to cry out. At the center of it all was a bend in the Confederate defenses known as the Mule Shoe. On May 12th, Union forces struck it in the early morning fog, a thunderous assault of 20,000 men. They broke through, clashing with Lee's veterans in a hand-to-hand struggle so brutal that muskets became clubs and bayonets bent like iron twigs. The fighting raged for 20 hours, uninterrupted. The ground turned to red clay and water, and the trenches filled with corpses until the living fought from behind the dead. One soldier wrote, "We fired until the barrels of our rifles burned our hands. When darkness fell, the two sides stood only yards apart, firing blindly into the night. The rain turned to steam as it struck the barrels of the guns. By morning, the Mule Shoe was gone. Nothing remained but mud, blood, and ruin. In those hours, the line between man and machine disappeared. The Civil War had become something new, a vision of the wars yet to come. Grant's army moved on, south again, always south. He refused to retreat, refused even to rest. His soldiers began to call it Grant's meat grinder. At North Anna, to Potomac Creek, and finally Cold Harbor. The same grim pattern repeated. Advance, assault, slaughter, dig in, advance again. By June, the men were ghosts, faces hollow, boots worn to shreds, uniforms caked in mud. They had fought nonstop for 40 days. The smell of death followed them like weather. Then, on June 3, 1864, Grant ordered another attack, this time at Cold Harbor, 10 miles northeast of Richmond. Lee's army, though exhausted, had fortified every hill and trench with ruthless precision. The Union soldiers could see the enemy lines bristling with guns. Yet the order came anyway. At dawn, thousands of Union troops climbed out of their trenches and advanced across open ground. They were met by a wall of fire. Within 10 minutes, entire regiments were erased. Within 27,000 men had fallen. Some never even fired their muskets. Those who survived clawed shallow pits in the earth and lay there under the sun, unable to move, unable to help their dying comrades who cried out all day and into the night. One soldier pinned his name to his uniform before the assault, knowing he would not come back. When word reached Grant, he went silent for a long time. Then he said quietly, "I regret this assault more than any I ever ordered." He had learned what every commander eventually must, that even victory can taste like ash. At Cold Harbor, courage met futility, and both were buried in the same soil. For Lee's men, the victory was hollow. They had held the line, but at a cost they could not afford. The Confederacy was dying from within. Supplies ran low, food vanished, horses starved. Confederate soldiers deserted by the hundreds, writing home that they would rather die with their families than in the trenches. In Richmond, civilians boiled shoe leather for soup. In the countryside, mothers buried sons with no coffins, only prayers. The glory that had fueled the rebellion was gone, replaced by hunger and grief. Still, Lee held firm. His defensive genius turned every hill into a fortress, but he knew deep down that Grant's strategy was working. The North could replace its losses. The South could not. Every Union casualty could be filled. Every Confederate death was irreplaceable. The war had become arithmetic, and the numbers favored the Union. Grant now shifted his army east, slipping around Lee's flank toward Petersburg, the last rail link to Richmond. Lee followed, exhausted but vigilant. There, the two armies dug in, beginning a siege that would last 10 months, a grim prelude to modern warfare. The trenches of Petersburg stretched for 40 miles, filled with mud, rats, and despair. Soldiers on both sides huddled in filth, sniped at shadows, and prayed for an end that never came. It was here that the Civil War ceased to be a 19th century conflict and became the first glimpse of the industrial wars of the future. Men were no longer fighting for honor or victory, but for endurance, for survival, for the faint hope of going home alive. The war that had begun with flags and drums was ending in silence and smoke. By late summer, the once proud Army of the Potomac was unrecognizable. Entire brigades existed only on paper. Fields once green were now churned into wasteland. And yet, through it all, Grant did not falter. He knew that even as his men bled in Virginia, Sherman was marching through Georgia, cutting the South in two once more. The plan was working. Slowly, painfully, the Confederacy was being strangled. When critics in Washington demanded his removal, Lincoln refused. He told them, "Grant will not back down. He will press on, and that is what we need." The president understood that the war had reached its cruel but necessary stage, the stage where mercy could mean defeat, and endurance was the only road to peace. By autumn, the North was weary, the South was starving, and the world watched a continent tearing itself apart. In Virginia's trenches, Men stared across the no-man's land that separated blue from gray. Too tired to hate, too numb to fear, Grant's army had become what he always intended, a hammer that never stopped striking. And with every blow, the Confederacy cracked a little more. The forests had burned, the rivers had run dry, and still the war raged on. But far to the south, another army was on the move, and its path would change everything. Join us in Part 3, Sherman's March to the Sea. Subscribe now, and stay with us as the fire spreads across the heart of the Confederacy. By the autumn of 1864, the war had devoured everything: men, cities, hope. In Virginia, Grant's armies clawed at Lee's defenses outside Petersburg, locked in a stalemate that seemed eternal. But far to the south, another storm was gathering, a storm with fire at its heart. Its name was William Tecumseh Sherman, and his march would burn its way into legend. Sherman was unlike any general the war had yet produced. He did not believe in single battles or glorious victories. He believed in breaking the enemy's will to fight. "War is cruelty," he once said, "and you cannot refine it." By September 1864, his army, nearly 100,000 strong, had captured Atlanta, the industrial heart of the South. The city burned behind them as black smoke rose into the sky. For the Confederacy, it was a wound deeper than any defeat on the battlefield. Atlanta's fall electrified the North. Lincoln, who only months earlier feared defeat in the upcoming election, suddenly saw hope restored. Crowds cheered in Union cities as newspapers declared, "Atlanta is ours," and fairly won. But for Sherman, Atlanta was only the beginning. His next move would be unlike anything America had ever seen. He would march his army from Atlanta to the sea, cutting a 300-mile path across Georgia, living off the land, destroying railroads, factories, farms, and anything that could support the Confederate war effort. He would make the South taste the very destruction it had unleashed. He wasn't marching to capture cities. He was marching to break a nation's spirit. Before leaving Atlanta, Sherman sent a letter to his superior, General Grant. "I can make Georgia howl," he wrote. Grant's reply was simple: "Go ahead." On November 15, 1864, Sherman's army divided into two great columns and began its march. Behind them, Atlanta smoldered. Its railways twisted into grotesque shapes the soldiers called Sherman's neckties. Ahead of them stretched fields, forests and farms that had fed the Confederacy for years. They moved like a living storm, 60,000 men, thousands of wagons, and endless lines of blue uniforms. They sang as they marched, marching through Georgia. Everywhere they went, they tore up railroads, burned crops, seized livestock, and freed enslaved families. Sherman had given strict orders. His men were not to harm civilians, but they were to take everything that could support the Southern Army. In practice, discipline wavered. Some soldiers looted, others destroyed in anger. The line between necessity and vengeance blurred. For those who witnessed it, the march was unforgettable. One Confederate woman wrote, "The sky itself seems to burn. They take our food, our horses, our homes. They leave nothing but ashes." But Sherman was unmoved. He believed every smoldering field brought the war closer to its end. "If the people raise war against us," he said, "they must see what war truly means." For the first time, the war marched not just against armies, but against the very idea of resistance. Sherman's men advanced 10 to 15 miles a day. They faced no major Confederate army, only scattered cavalry and militias too weak to stop them. Behind them, Georgia collapsed. Bridges, railroads, and telegraph lines vanished in smoke. Entire counties were left in ruins. Yet amid the destruction came something new: freedom. Tens of thousands of enslaved men, women, and children followed the Union columns. They came barefoot, carrying what little they owned, believing that behind the Union flag lay salvation. One soldier wrote, "They come in flocks, crying and singing, praising God and Lincoln. But the march was cruel to them too. Food was scarce. Disease spread quickly. Thousands perished on the road. Sherman, torn between compassion and pragmatism, struggled with what to do. "We cannot feed the world," he said bitterly, "but I cannot turn them away." At one crossing on the Ogeechee River, a pontoon bridge collapsed under the weight of fleeing freedmen. Hundreds drowned before soldiers could pull them to safety. The river turned dark with mud and sorrow. Even in victory, the march left deep scars, on land and on the human soul. Freedom and fire walked side by side, and neither could be stopped. By early December, Sherman's men neared the Atlantic. The city of Savannah lay ahead, its port vital to the Confederate cause. Southern newspapers begged for resistance, but there was none left. The Confederacy's armies were scattered. The people were broken. On December 21, 1864, Savannah surrendered without a fight. Sherman wired a message to Lincoln that read, "I beg to present you as a Christmas gift the city of Savannah, with 150 heavy guns and 25,000 bales of cotton." The message reached the White House on Christmas Eve. Lincoln read it in silence, then smiled faintly. For the first time in years, there was hope that the war might finally end. But even in triumph, Sherman felt no joy. He rode through Savannah's quiet streets, past homes untouched by battle, and said, "We have done what we had to do." To him, destruction was not cruelty. It was mercy in disguise. The faster the South broke, the faster the war would end. Yet for many Southerners, the march would never be forgotten. They called it the Devil's March, a memory of smoke and ruin passed down through generations. But history would remember it differently, as the moment America's modern warfare was born. Sherman had shown the world that armies could defeat not just soldiers, but societies, that the will of a people could be crushed without a single decisive battle. When Sherman reached the sea, the Confederacy's back was broken. The South still fought on, but the fire that once burned in its heart was now only smoke on the horizon. The Union had marched through Georgia and torn the rebellion in two. But even as the flames died down, one question remained. Could America rise again from the ashes it had made of itself? By the winter of 1864, America was unrecognizable. From Virginia's trenches to Georgia's ashes, the land itself seemed exhausted. Its forests burned, its rivers choked with wreckage. 3 years of war had devoured everything: youth, hope, mercy. But one man still carried the weight of it all, quiet, weary, and unbroken. His name was Abraham Lincoln. The lines around his eyes were deeper, his steps slower. He had led the nation through blood and grief, and yet peace seemed as distant as ever. Even after Sherman's victory in Georgia, the North was divided. Thousands of soldiers lay buried in fields no one could name. Families wept in every town, and a growing chorus in Washington whispered that the war must end, even if it meant peace without victory. Lincoln refused. He knew what such peace would mean: the survival of slavery, the death of freedom. "I cannot bargain with evil," he said quietly. "This nation must be made whole, and it cannot be whole while it is half slave and half free." In the spring of 1864, Lincoln faced his greatest test yet: re-election. After 4 years of war, his popularity had collapsed. Newspapers mocked him. Politicians abandoned him. Even some Union generals doubted he could win. In August, he confided to his cabinet, "It seems exceedingly probable that this administration will not be re-elected." He believed he would lose, and that his successor would end the war by compromise. But history had other plans. Sometimes destiny waits until all hope is gone, and then in one blinding moment, it turns the tide. As autumn approached, news from the front changed everything. Sherman had taken Atlanta. Grant held Lee trapped outside Petersburg. The Union, though bleeding, was winning. The victories rekindled Northern morale. Crowds gathered in the streets waving flags, singing again. The nation's faith, long buried beneath grief, began to stir. In November 1864, Americans went to the polls in the middle of a war. It was the first time in history that a democracy had held an election while fighting for its own survival. Lincoln won in a landslide. Even soldiers at the front cast their votes for him, writing letters home that said simply, "We will finish what we started." When the results reached him, Lincoln bowed his head and whispered, "I am thankful that we have been saved from destruction." The people had spoken. The Union would fight on, not just to preserve the nation, but to purify it. The war was nearing its end, but the test of Lincoln's soul had only begun. As 1865 dawned, the Confederacy was collapsing. Grant's siege strangled Petersburg. Lee's army starved in its trenches. In the Carolinas, Sherman marched north, cutting the South's last arteries. The dream of a Confederate nation flickered like a dying flame, yet Lincoln's heart grew heavier. He knew victory would come soon, but how victory was handled would define everything. Many in the North demanded revenge, executions, punishments, retribution. Lincoln refused. With malice toward none, with charity for all, he said, "Let us strive on to finish the work we are in." He dreamed not of vengeance, but of healing, of a nation reborn through mercy. His second inaugural address, delivered on March 4, 1865, was not a celebration, but a prayer. He stood beneath gray skies as rain fell and said, "Fondly do we hope, fervently do we pray, that this mighty scourge of war may speedily pass away." And then he gave words that would echo forever. "Yet, if God wills that it continue until all the wealth piled by the bondsman's 250 years of unrequited toil shall be sunk, and until every drop of blood drawn with the lash shall be paid by another drawn with the sword, so still it must be said, the judgments of the Lord are true and righteous altogether." Even as the end approached, Lincoln saw the war not as triumph, but as penance, a reckoning for a nation's sin. For every battle fought in the fields, another was fought in the human heart, between hatred and forgiveness, vengeance and grace. By April, the long nightmare was nearly over. Lee's lines at Petersburg finally broke. His army retreated west toward Appomattox Courthouse, desperate to escape. Grant followed relentlessly, cutting him off again and again until there was nowhere left to go. On April 9, 1865, in a quiet parlor in Appomattox, Robert E. Lee surrendered to Ulysses S. Grant. The two men spoke softly, soldiers to soldiers. Grant offered generous terms, no punishment, no humiliation. Lee's men could return home, keeping their horses to put in the spring crops. When word reached Lincoln, he wept. Not for victory, but for peace at last. He told a crowd gathered outside the White House, "We must bind up the nation's wounds and deal with all in kindness." But the war's final cost had yet to be paid. Just 5 days later, on April 14th, Lincoln attended a play at Ford's Theater in Washington. As laughter filled the room, a single shot rang out. The man who had saved the Union, who had freed millions and dreamed of mercy, fell before his nation could heal. The news spread like thunder. Church bells tolled, cities went silent, soldiers wept openly. Even those who had once cursed him now mourned. The South had lost its cause, and the North its conscience. As Lincoln's coffin traveled by train back to Illinois, millions lined the tracks in silence. They placed flowers, flags, and notes of farewell. One Union soldier wrote, "We have won the war, but lost the peace." The dream of America now belonged to the living, to finish what Lincoln had begun. The cannons had gone quiet, but the echoes of that struggle would shape the nation for generations. The age of total war had ended, but the battle for America's soul, for freedom, equality, and unity, was just beginning. final call, and next episode, tease. In our next and final episode, Episode 7, Rebirth of a Nation, 1865-1877, we'll witness the fragile dawn of Reconstruction, the birth of freedom for millions, and the fight to rebuild a country torn apart by war. Stay with us for the conclusion of the American Civil War. And if you haven't already, subscribe now. Your support keeps history alive, and the story of a nation's rebirth deserves to be seen to the very end.